The Age of Reagan, A History, 1974 through 2008, by Sean Wilentz, narrated by Dick Hill, copyright 2008 by Sean Wilentz. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with HarperCollins Publishers and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. To the memory of Alfred Kazin and Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. Introduction. Just as the period of American history from 1933 to the late 1960s, between the rise of the New Deal and the fall of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, was chiefly one of liberal reform, so the past 35 years have been an era of conservatism. Although briefly interrupted in the late 1970s and temporarily reversed in the 1990s, a powerful surge of conservative politics has dominated American politics and government. This book relates the basic story of the political trends and events of the era and interprets conservatism's ascendancy. I have not been motivated by a wish to discover the deep cultural, economic, social, or psychological factors that might explain recent political history, although all these factors do come into play. Nor do I wish to add to the copious literature of either hagiography or vilification about our recent and current political leaders. I want instead to provide a fresh, succinct, and accessible chronicle of American history, focused on political history after 1974. I especially hope to account for how a conservative movement once deemed marginal managed to seize power and hold it, and what the consequences have been. The title points to the straightforward proposition that Ronald Reagan has been the single most important political figure of the age. Without Reagan, the conservative movement would never have been as successful as it was. In his political persona, as well as his policies, Reagan embodied a new fusion of deeply conservative politics with some of the rhetoric and even a bit of the spirit of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and of John F. Kennedy's New Frontier. This is not to say that Reagan alone caused the long wave of conservative domination. Far from it. But in American political history there have been a few leading figures, most of them presidents, who, for better or worse, have put their political stamp indelibly on their time. They include Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan. It says something about the literature of American history and the relative paucity of historical scholarship thus far about Reagan and his era that he is the outstanding conservative figure on the list. Almost immediately after Franklin Roosevelt died in office in 1945, historians began chronicling and debating the history of the New Deal. By contrast, although some biographies of varying quality appeared, the best of them by the journalist Lou Cannon, nothing like this kind of outpouring by historians followed Reagan's departure from office in 1989. Only recently, approaching 20 years later, have historians begun to produce a substantial body of work on Reagan's presidency and its effects. It is no secret that much of the American intelligentsia disliked Reagan, whereas intellectuals, and for that matter, Ronald Reagan, admired Franklin Roosevelt. But that difference does not fully explain the lack of historical scholarship on the age of Reagan, because admiring conservatives, like dismayed liberals, have until recently written fairly little about Reagan except memoirs or panegyrics. In part, historians have been badly hampered by tightened restrictions on the release of presidential and related papers, especially the rules imposed by the George W. Bush administration in 2001, which, although ostensibly intended to aid the further implementation of the Presidential Records Act of 1978, effectively overturned the act by executive order. As a result of these restrictions, a great deal of interesting material from the Reagan administration onward is now under lock and key. If this unfortunate secrecy was intended to protect certain reputations, it has had the additional effect of rendering its chief beneficiaries less imposing historically than they might otherwise be, because their full stories, quite simply, cannot be told. But there are deeper explanations as well. Historians have long been drawn to leaders whom they identify with progressive efforts to humanize the workings of American democracy and other conditions of American life. There are more books about Theodore Roosevelt than there are about all of the 6 Gilded Age presidents who preceded him combined. Reagan doesn't fit the preferred mold. A conservative hero in a conservative age, he is either so admired by the minority of conservatives in the Academy or so disliked by the others that it has seemed as if he and his administration have been difficult to evaluate fairly. I sometimes have the impression that the preponderance of American historians would prefer simply to skip over the Reagan era as a bad dream and write instead of times and figures they find more attractive. Edmund Morris, a distinguished biographer of Theodore Roosevelt, was selected as Reagan's authorized biographer and granted unprecedented access during and after his presidency. Morris discovered that Reagan was not the two-dimensional icon he had imagined, yet he was so confounded by what he described as Reagan's strange combination of passivity, neglect of important issues of the day, especially the AIDS crisis, and murky motives, that he retreated into partial fictionalization, inventing characters to interact with a Reagan he confessed he could not truly understand. Morris's book contains a great deal of useful information, but his limited comprehension and odd literary decisions also render it an enormous opportunity lost. Although I am sharply critical of Reagan's leadership, my views have ripened over time, and in any case, I believe Reagan and his presidency were so important that they deserve more scholarly attention than they have received. I hope that this book, building on some fine, very recent works, can help remedy the situation and spur further historical assessments of the era in which Reagan was the preeminent political figure. The book draws on numerous primary documents that have either been previously neglected or only recently released to the public, and that offer interesting revelations. But I do not pretend to be presenting a treasury of archival riches, let alone to be rendering a final judgment. I instead hope to provide a new and longer view of the subject, offer definitions of some important matters, and open up lines of inquiry and debate. Taking the longer view requires expanding the chronological frame of reference. The age of Reagan was not limited to Reagan's 8 years in the White House, any more than the ages of Jefferson, Jackson, and Franklin Roosevelt were limited to their respective presidential terms. Like all major periods in our political history, the Reagan era had a long prelude in which an existing political order crumbled and the Republican right rose to power, as well as a long postlude in which Reagan's presidency continued to set the tone for American politics. Taking the story back through the end of the Nixon administration is essential in order to understand both the political dynamics that contributed to Reagan's success and many of the individuals who played important political roles through the 1980s and after. These include such figures as George H.W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney, veterans of the Nixon administration who served as important officials under Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford. Extending the story into the presidency of George W. Bush shows how, for good or ill, Reagan's legacy has played out in foreign as well as domestic affairs. It also shows how, under Reagan's Republican successors as well as under Bill Clinton, his legacy gradually began to unravel. Limitations of sources and historical, as opposed to political, writing persuaded me to restrict the discussion of George W. Bush's presidency to an epilogue. I do not at all intend this as a commentary on the relative importance of the period after 2000. Rather, I want to convey due respect for the endeavors of future historians who will examine the period in far greater detail than I can now, and, I hope, test the broad interpretations I offer of Bush's White House and its war on terror as part of the age of Reagan. Reagan's rise was hardly inevitable. It resulted from a complex confluence of factors. 8 years before Reagan's election, President Richard M. Nixon, beginning his second term, contemplated what he called an epic battle, aimed at greatly augmenting the power of the executive. Had it not been for the Watergate scandal, which came close to being suppressed, Nixon could well have succeeded in creating his own imperial presidency. Without Watergate, the large political opening that gave Reagan his first strong shot at the presidency probably would not have existed, and Reagan, the shining hope of the conservative movement, might never have been nominated, let alone elected. Neither, in all likelihood, would the Democrats have fallen into the false sense of assurance that misled them so badly following Nixon's downfall. In terms of voter alignment, the conservative turning point came in 1968, not 1980. It was by no means certain, though, that the turn would bring about the Reagan era, or conservatism as it then developed. But for the highly contingent turns of fortune, this book might have been titled The Age of Nixon. The Watergate affair did not, to be sure, cause an utter break with the past. Reagan benefited enormously from the so-called Southern political strategy that Nixon pioneered, and by building on it, he won 2 smashing electoral victories. Several of Nixon's policy positions, notably in the areas of school desegregation and judicial appointments, foreshadowed Reagan's. As would become clear during Gerald Ford's presidency, some of Nixon's men, including Rumsfeld and Cheney, drew closer to Reagan in their thinking, especially on foreign policy. And after he entered the White House, Reagan, who admired Nixon's knowledge of foreign affairs and world leaders, quietly consulted with the ex-president, especially during his second term. In addition, some of Nixon's top aides, as well as some of his younger political strategists and operatives, remained very much a part of both the conservative movement and the Republican Party after Nixon's departure. They included 2 of Nixon's speechwriters, Patrick J. Buchanan, who became ubiquitous on the radio and in the early 1980s on cable television, and William Safire, who left the White House in 1973 to become an influential political columnist for the New York Times, where he would remain for the next 3 decades. They also included 2 men who got their start as national leaders of the college Republicans under Nixon, Lee Atwater and Karl Rove. In all these respects, the Age of Reagan carried forward political proclivities and personalities of Richard Nixon's aborted presidency. Still, the political as well as temperamental differences between Nixon and Reagan were fundamental. Reagan, a committed ideological conservative, attempted to push American government and politics in a more decisive conservative direction than Nixon did, and far more so than his chief Republican rival in 1980, George H.W. Bush, would in later years. In foreign affairs, Nixon's policy of détente was anathema to the Reagan forces, who followed a very different set of assumptions and priorities regarding the Soviet Union. How successfully Reagan accomplished what he set out to do is one of this book's basic themes. Another theme concerns how much these successes and failures actually had to do with conservative ideology about supply-side economics and confronting the Soviet Union and its proxies around the globe, the heart of what became known as the Reagan Doctrine. The conclusions I have reached differ greatly from those advanced with increasing fervor in recent years by Reagan's admirers. They differ from those of his most vociferous critics, and they differ in several ways from the conclusions I would have expected myself to draw about Reagan's presidency and about much else when I began work on this book several years ago. The Reagan era unfolded amid major social and political transitions in the United States. An urban society that had emerged during the decades before the Second World War became a society dominated, at least numerically, by suburban dwellers. While older industrial centers in the North and Midwest declined, Sunbelt areas boomed. The Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s and later feminist agitation broke down old barriers of prejudice, but also fostered potentially inflammatory resentments. The economy fell prey by 1973 to an alarming new syndrome, stagflation, which led many expert economists to believe that America's world economic supremacy was ending. A system of national party politics governed by old big city and statewide machines and entrenched political professionals gave way to another party system, superficially more open, in which party loyalties among the voters became attenuated and individual candidates' success depended increasingly on their ability to raise large sums of money to cover heavy media costs. The trauma of President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, followed by the foreshortened presidencies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, generated widespread public alienation from electoral politics and mainstream politicians. The disastrous war in Vietnam cracked open the bipartisan consensus over containment that had held during the Cold War and badly divided Democrats against Democrats and Republicans against Republicans, as well as against the opposing party. The capture and command of the political initiative by the Reagan right resulted from all these changes. Above all, Reagan and his supporters, unlike the battered Democrats and the disgraced Republican establishment, gave the voters a compelling way to comprehend the disorienting and often dispiriting trends of the 1970s, and to see those trends not as a product of their own defects, as Reagan's Democratic predecessor Jimmy Carter came to imply, but as a consequence of bad leadership. With Reagan as its likable, ever-optimistic standard-bearer and ultimate symbol, the Republican right delivered what sounded like straightforward, common-sense solutions to the nation's ills. Cut taxes, shrink government domestic spending, encourage private investment, and keep the military strong while aiding those abroad who were fighting communist tyranny. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems, Reagan proclaimed in the speech that first brought him attention as a politician. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our heart is morally right. Compared with the various Democratic appeals, the updated, moderate Southern progressivism of Jimmy Carter, the retooled New Deal liberalism personified by Walter Mondale, the cool rationalism of Michael Dukakis, this seemed a forward-looking message with conviction as well as confidence. With some brilliant turns, Reagan and his supporters managed to appropriate the bold, unapologetic nationalism once celebrated by Franklin D. Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy and attach it to political causes that Roosevelt and Kennedy would have found anathema. Into the early 1990s, that mixture helped cement what looked for a time like a formidable national electoral coalition. And after the bitterly contested, strange presidential election of 2000, conservative republicanism received a new lease on life in a highly radicalized form, made possible through a majority decision by 5 activist justices on the Supreme Court. Political pundits have been forecasting the imminent collapse of the Reagan era for many years, since the middle of Reagan's own first term. Harsh public reaction to economic catastrophe and large electoral gains by the Democrats in 1982 prompted David Broder, the dean of political journalism in Washington, to observe that Reaganism was merely a one-year phenomenon, and that Reagan's presidency had quickly reached its phase-out point. In 1986, the Republicans lost control of the Senate, and only weeks later the outbreak of the Iran-Contra scandal sent Reagan's public opinion ratings crashing. Bill Clinton's victory in 1992, followed by public disgust at the Republicans' shutdown of the government in 1995 and at their impeachment of Clinton 3 years later, seemed to presage the conservatives' demise. Yet the Republican Party, by now thoroughly Reaganized, rebounded. In 2006, midway through George W. Bush's calamitous second term, the Democrats won majorities in the House and Senate for the first time in a dozen years. With Democrats taking charge of congressional committees to oversee and, if necessary, investigate the White House, an important power shift took place in Washington. Nevertheless, even after the debacle in Iraq, the loss of a major American city to Hurricane Katrina, the Bush administration's failed assault on Social Security, and numerous scandals, the Democratic majorities were small, especially in the Senate, where the Democrats clung to a one-vote majority. During the early phases of the fight for the presidency in 2008, there were signs that the Age of Reagan had run its course, but the political outcome remained far from predictable. The true measure of the success of any political movement, though, does not rest simply on which party controls the Congress and the White House at any given moment. There are other government institutions to consider. Looking to the long term, Reagan and his Republican successors managed, through highly politicized appointments, to push the ideological makeup of the federal judiciary far to the right. The federal courts, once pilloried by conservatives, have become something of a bulwark of conservatism, and will remain so for decades to come, impervious to the ups and downs of electoral politics. The impact of the Age of Reagan is indicated even more strongly by the guiding assumptions and possibilities of American politics and government, and the hold they have on public opinion. 30 years ago, the proposition that reducing taxes on the rich was the best solution for all economic problems inspired only a few on the right-wing fringe. Today, it drives the national domestic agenda, and is so commonplace that it sometimes appears to have become the conventional wisdom. It is only one of many such notions, including proposals that public schools teach the pseudoscience of intelligent design, as well as Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea that wealthy business buccaneers should have a large say in formulating federal policy, and the so-called unitary executive theory of presidential power, that have moved from the political margins to the center of power. Buttressed by mythical accounts of the past 35 years, as well as by changed standards of truth and objectivity in the news media, conservatives in the Age of Reagan learned how to seize and keep control of the terms of public debate, skills that liberal Democrats had once mastered, but lost amid their political complacency in the 1970s and disarray in the 1980s. Finally, the Reagan era witnessed fundamental challenges to the nation's constitutional order and how Americans understand it. The era began with a severe constitutional crisis caused by Nixon's usurpation of executive powers that produced the Watergate scandal. 3 more spectacular constitutional confrontations, which might easily have turned into crises, ensued during the next quarter-century, over the Iran-Contra scandal, the impeachment of President Clinton, and the Supreme Court's decision to determine the presidential election of 2000. The first 2 revived issues that had hovered over Nixon's self-destruction. In Iran-Contra, the proper powers of the president in foreign and military affairs, and in the impeachment of Clinton, the standards by which a president should be impeached and removed from office. All 3 struggles raised profound questions and provoked passionate debate about the legitimate structure of authority in modern American democracy. Since 2000, President George W. Bush has provoked renewed and even deeper concerns by repeatedly asserting his virtually absolute authority as president to run what he has called his war on terror, a war that Congress has never formally declared, however he sees fit. Although conservatives have not always triumphed in these constitutional confrontations, the fact that the confrontations recurred after Nixon reveals once more how powerful the right became after 1980, and how the right has attempted to change, fundamentally, the nation's political order. Readers may be skeptical about my decision to extend this book to cover the very recent past. How can a historian write authoritatively and with detachment about events he or she has lived through, right up to the near present? Some readers might also ask why, given my own writings about politics as well as history over the years, this book ought to be considered objective and above partisanship. How, in particular, can I write as a historian about events in which I played a public, albeit minor, role, including testifying as an expert witness before the House Judiciary Committee during Clinton's impeachment and supporting Al Gore's candidacy in the election of 2000? Most of the book involves events that occurred a decade ago and more, far longer than it took the historical literature on other eras, including the age of Franklin D. Roosevelt, to begin the task of interpretation. Sufficient time has now passed to produce a sound, if in some respects incomplete, body of scholarship about these events, as well as for passions to have receded sufficiently to permit analysis with convincing documentation and reasoned argument. It is true that, more than for earlier eras, accounts of this one will long be hampered by the disturbing new rules governing release of official materials. Historical judgments may be subject to greater revision than such judgments usually are, when and if these materials see the light of day. But to succumb to these artificial limitations, ignore the abundant documentation that does exist, and refrain from writing the nation's history during the last quarter of the 20th century would be an abdication of responsibility for a historian. The analysis of more current events in the epilogue flows from my contention that Ronald Reagan's presidency has had an enduring impact. With regard to assessing the present and recent past as a historian, the late Theodore Draper, writing in defense of what he called present history, expressed my own view. I have written for the reader who was no longer interested in the daily or even weekly ration of news. This reader wanted to understand it in some organized form and in some historical perspective. No doubt, the organization and perspective would change as time went on and more information or insight became available. Life cannot wait, however, for historians to gather enough evidence to satisfy them or make up their minds once they get it. Even a preliminary organization and perspective represent an advance, however provisional. We must make do with what we have while it is still possible to do something about the matter. Like Draper's, my purpose in this final portion of the book is to analyze present-day events historically. That kind of analysis seems to have sadly diminished in our public deliberations. This book is not an exercise in projecting the concerns of the present into the past, what is sometimes called presentism. My aim is exactly the opposite, to see what light the recent and not-so-recent past throws on the present. Also, like Draper, I did not conduct a single interview in connection with this book. In part, this decision was a matter of practicality. Arranging for, conducting, and sorting through the scores, possibly hundreds of interviews demanded by a study of this scope would have delayed the book's completion for many years, and might even have prevented me from ever finishing. More important, I am suspicious of interviews as a reliable source for historians, especially political historians. Journalists, in their normal role of reporting on deadline, must depend on interviews to establish basic facts quickly. But historians who rely heavily on interviews run the risk of being manipulated by their informants in ways they cannot be by primary documents and secondary sources. Trying to write an unbiased account of recent times is difficult enough using the kinds of materials that historians traditionally have interpreted. Written sources have abundant lures and snares of their own. I am certain, though, that opening my evidence and analysis to the dance of subjectivities that interviewing involves would have made it all the more difficult to attain detachment. My past experiences interviewing political leaders of various stripes for magazines and journals of opinion reinforced that judgment. If I have thereby sacrificed the conceit of insider, fly-on-the-wall immediacy, or forfeited juicy quotations and anecdotes for the sake of pursuing dispassionate history, I think that the book is the better for it. Concerning issues of objectivity and partisanship, I firmly believe that it is possible for a historian.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?